The great debate right now in Congress, on Wall Street, on the web is how to get the flagging economic recovery back on track. Do we need to throw more taxpayer money at it, as we did in the dark days of 2009? Or do we need to stop spending before we dig ourselves so deeply into debt that we do long-term harm? And we'll take up that question right here with two passionate online contributors to the debate. Barry Ritholtz, money manager and author of the highly influential blog, The Big Picture, and Keith McCullough, who's been a guest here before, former hedge fund analyst and author of the blog hedgeye.com. Gentlemen, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
All right, Keith, let me start with you. All right, the idea behind stimulus is pretty clear. You substitute government demand for flagging consumer demand. President Obama, his chief economic advisor, Christina Romer, are roaming the country right now trying to argue that they've created 3 million jobs that wouldn't be there otherwise, added 3 percentage points to GDP. So why not continue what's working?
I'd say that it's not working. So the first, anytime we have an economic problem and we come up with a resolution, or at least a perceived resolution that doesn't work, the first thing you need to do is stop what you're doing. Then start to focus on what's actually happening and start to listen to actually the market and the Main Street side of the debate, which
So you don't believe the president and his chief economic advisor on this?
Oh, absolutely not. I don't think that we've gotten anything right from a policy perspective in the last decade. And if you look at that from, whether it be from the dollar's perspective, which continues to make lower lows, or unemployment, we have a net jobs addition number in the last decade of 0. I think that that's the vote and the writings on the wall.
And flat wages over that same decade.
But the market is up 60% since we started to throw money at the problem. Isn't that a sign that the market anticipates higher growth?
Well, the market is up 60% off the lows. It's still down 35% from the highs. You have these volatile swings from peak to trough and back. People seem to think the market is forecasting or reading this. What was the market forecasting in October '07 at 14,000? What was the NASDAQ forecasting in March 2003 at 1,100? So we have to take that in a grain of salt and put it in the context of the ups and downs that markets go through under their normal process.
And the ups and downs, the volatility that we've seen in the last decade are unprecedented. So what I'd submit is that government intervention, and big-time government intervention, and we're asking for more of that, has created higher levels or amplified levels of volatility and shortened durations or economic cycles. So what we're doing is we're really churning and burning, creating bubbles, blowing them up. Real estate, tech, you go through it. It's a multiple occurrence based on the same spending idea or big Keynesian intervention.
See, I draw a distinction. I don't totally disagree with Keith, but I draw a distinction between what the Federal Reserve does with their monetary policy and what the government itself does with its fiscal policy. We've had a very easy monetary policy. We've had a series of bubbles. The first bubble was the dot-com bubble, which indirectly you have to trace back to the Fed. We had a commodity bubble, a collapse in the dollar, clearly caused by 1% Fed fund rates, and then we had this credit bubble, which led to this big boom and bust in housing. So we're simpatico when it comes to, hey, the Fed has been really causing a lot of problems over the past couple of decades. Where I think Keith and I disagree is you look through history, you look at when the time is to focus on deficits, focus on the budget, not go into deficit spending, and in a recession or just coming out of it is really not the ideal time to do it. Think back over the past 10 years, when the economy is expanding, when housing was booming, when employment was going up, that's when you focus on saving and deficits. You don't say, I'm out of work, okay, I guess I better not do anything. I'm just going to sit at home and wait for the world to pass. If you believe in any sort of stimulus, the time to do it is in a recession or just after. I think long term we have to deal with the deficit. We just shouldn't make the same mistake we made in 1937 to 38 and caused another recession.
Well, that's a great point. So the downside to cutting off the government spigot, the fiscal spigot right now, is that you worsen the recession. You recreate the downturn that happened in 1937 when FDR and the administration then decided that the Great Depression was over and they could raise taxes and cut spending. It triggered another recession. Are you willing to take that risk right now?
Well, everyone wants to be alarmist and use the Depression as their example because it gets people scared. It's not unlike what Rumsfeld did in a different regard. The government's MO is to scare the living daylights out of people, and guess what? They're scared. But the reality is that spending, getting it under control or stop overspending. You have to get tax receipts at least in the area code of spending. If you're running a company or if you're running your own personal P&L, that's the exercise. That's exactly what you're seeing consumers do. We're daring them to take on mortgages. We've seen 8 consecutive weeks of MBA mortgage applications go down week over week. They're not taking on the dare. So what the government needs to do is tighten the gap between tax receipts and spending, not end spending. That would be ridiculous. I mean, you have to have some level of spending, but you have to have some level of spending that's in line with the reality of the economy that you have.
Don't you have to prime the pump? I mean, you don't want to trigger another recession. That will do terrible things to tax receipts and make the government spending, it'll create the deficit in the opposite direction.
Right, you got to prime the pump, but you can't keep priming it when it becomes a sewer pump. I mean, look, the reality is that there are 2 ratios that matter that the world's watching, 2 big-time ratios, deficit as a percentage of GDP and debt as a percentage of GDP. And unfortunately, we've gone back to that old sewer well enough times where our ratios are going to be bumping up exactly at the same levels of Spain and Greece in 2011 if we don't get the ratios in line.
But remember, Spain and Greece are tied to the euro. Even the euro is not the world's reserve currency. In the United States, we have certain options and certain flexibility that the rest of the world doesn't have. So we have the dollar as the currency reserve. That's number one. Number two, we have a very dynamic economy and a very resilient economy that despite the potential downside, despite the recession risks, the United States could deal with a couple of more years of aggressive deficit spending. We don't have to go back to the Depression. Just look at what Ronald Reagan did, elected in 1980, massive tax cuts in 81 and 82, and he spent the rest of the next 7 years slowly taking back those tax cuts and slowly reducing some of the deficits. He never closed the gap, but that is the model. And stop and think about it. Here's a president who comes in the middle of a bad recession, 1980, and a double dip in 82, at the end of a 16-year bear market where the Dow had gone sideways for 16 years. The parallels to Barack Obama are surprisingly similar. Comes in 10 years, 11 years, no change in the market, essentially flat at the same place where it was 10 years ago. Weak job creation, recession. He should be taking plays out of the Reagan playbook and say, we're going to do some big deficit spending for a couple of years. We're going to do some big tax cuts. We're going to get things moving. And the rest of my term is going to be spent taking away this and focusing on the deficit. I think you could do worse than the Reagan playbook, especially for a Democrat.
I don't disagree with the Reagan playbook. I mean, I've actually gone back to that a lot. And I think that gets me at least halfway there in terms of tax. You got to solve that side of the equation. You can't solve the revenue side or the tax receipt side of the equation by big government spending only. You have to stimulate the American entrepreneur like me, like Barry, who wants to go out and hire somebody who can get a rate of return on that hire and keep hiring. You have to have a multiplier effect as opposed to the natural government spending dollar, which has been proven over decades of history. It has a negative multiplier effect. So you need a growth aspect to the revenue line if you want to get revenues in line with expenditures.
And the simple solution to that is you do a holiday for employment taxes between FICA and everything else. You can just put that away for 6 months or a year. You'll create literally millions of jobs because suddenly one of the biggest costs that go into hiring a new employee essentially goes away. So that's one way. That'll add to the deficit short term, but if we end up with 3 or 5 or 10 million new hires, well, ultimately that's going to generate enough revenue. You then take that tax break away, you let it naturally expire so you know exactly what the costs of that tax break are in advance, and then all of a sudden you're actually generating both economic activity and new hires, which can only be a positive.
Okay, a tax holiday. So Keith, you're president, you're Speaker of the House. What do you do? What would you do?
First, I'd bring Barry on board and I'd go with these because there's a big disconnect between what Barry said and what's actually happening. So we're actually eliminating tax holidays. There used to be tax holidays for retail shopping ahead of back to school in multiple states. Now we're pulling them back. New York State's doing that right now. I mean,
the states are all in terrible conditions.
Right.
They feel like they have no choice.
So
I don't agree with that, but that's what their perspective
there's the
is.
reality on the tax side, and then there's the ideas on the tax side. So what in the OMB estimates on the deficit to GDP.
All right, Keith, I'm going to stop you right here. So you've got is a sign off for this. What's the one thing that we got to do to get things back in line in your book?
I think you first stop spending at the rate that you're spending, and then start to focus on tax initiatives after that.
That'd be similar. And besides the tax holiday, is there something you'd like to put on the table?
Yeah, I would love to see the government do a new Manhattan project not to create the next atom bomb, but for alternative energy. Right now, the level of research that's being taken place is very incremental, very marginal. You need a fundamental breakthrough in things like converting solar energy, in battery storage, the sort of things that are too long-reaching for the private sector to do, and that governments and academia do really well, but you got to throw some money at it.
All right, good. All right. Barry, Keith, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching.